Argentinian Air Force was well trained and could launch high-performance fighter bombers from bases on the mainland. These aircraft could attack the task force once they were within range. On the 1st of May 1982, the Battle for the Falklands began. The first clash between Britain and Argentina was in the air. But despite being the underdog, the British immediately showed they were a force to be reckoned with. There was one thing that the Argentinians hadn't expected. Britain's latest acquisition, the Sea Harrier. God, you can feel the power of that thing. It's unbelievable. That's what's required to get it off this tiny deck. Whoa! This aircraft was brand new, untested in combat when it was sent to the Falklands. Unique in its ability to take off and land vertically and operate from short runways, the Harrier quickly proved it was versatile and extremely reliable. And the Harrier had another killer advantage. The British seemed to be smashing the Argentinian Air Force, but they could only maintain their advantage in the air while their ships below remained safe.
The most important ships in any naval task force are the aircraft carriers. If the carriers are lost, so too are their vital aircraft. The two aircraft carriers in the Falklands had to be protected at all costs. And although the action continued in the skies, the focus of the battle shifted to the rough seas of the South Atlantic.
Woodward's main task force was 100 miles northeast of the Falklands. The British government had declared a 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands and said it would attack anyone entering it. Up here to the northwest, a cluster of Argentinian warships was approaching.
She carried aircraft that would soon be within close range of the British fleet. But even more menacing, the British reckoned, was another group of ships to the south of the Falklands. A cruiser, the General Belgrano, and two destroyers.
These missiles could sink the British aircraft carriers if they got within range.
Argentinians appeared to be threatening a pincer movement against the British fleet. The carrier, the 25 de Mayo, from the north, and the Belgrano group from the south. The Belgrano group was being tracked by a submerged British submarine, the Conqueror. Conqueror's captain feared that if the Belgrano turned north, it would move into these shallow waters. The Conqueror would struggle to track the ship in the shallow water and risk losing sight of it. Beneath the waves, Conqueror's commanding officer saw that the Belgrano was steering an erratic course just outside the exclusion zone. The situation was so critical that the Prime Minister herself was consulted. She gave the order to attack. The Conqueror launched its torpedoes.
There were masses of injured men. Most of them had been burnt, and they were men covered in oil. When I got to my life raft, I asked a sailor to come with me again and look for the people that were missing, including the commander.
Within 45 minutes, the Belgrano had sunk. Immediately, the entire Argentinian Navy, fearful of further submarine attacks, turned round and headed home. The British had scored a huge military success, and Galtieri's plan seemed to be faltering. But he was still able to unleash the weapon the British feared most. The Argentinians had recently bought 5 air-launched exocets. These half-ton missiles could seek out and destroy a ship from over 30 miles away. On the morning of the 4th of May, 2 Argentinian strike aircraft, each armed with an exocet, took off from the mainland. On that morning, things had been relatively quiet for the British task force.
This is Alpha Whiskey, weapons free, Baker 5017, a strength 2.
Then, just before 2 o'clock, the Argentinian aircraft were picked up by the radar room on board HMS Glasgow. Glasgow immediately sent an urgent warning to all the other ships and went to full action stations herself.
Break! We're going atop the ship. Reminded the command aim remains to coordinate and fire full steadfast.
But 20 miles away, on board HMS Sheffield, the scene couldn't have been more different.
Here, the ops room wasn't fully manned, and only part of the message from the Glasgow was picked up. But it was worse than that. At that exact moment, HMS Sheffield was using its satellite equipment.
Aircraft now returning inbound at red 100.
Back on the Glasgow, 2 fast-moving dots, possible exocet missiles, suddenly appeared on the radar screen and were closing in at 700 miles an hour. With a mixture of relief and horror, the captain of the Glasgow realized that the missiles were headed not for them, but straight for the Sheffield. HMS Sheffield was the first British ship to be destroyed by enemy action since the Second World War. Of the 281 men aboard, 20 were killed and 26 were wounded. By mid-May, the South Atlantic winter was closing in. Some Harriers had been lost in combat, and now the bad weather was beginning to hinder the pilots. The success of the British plan relied on having complete control of the air to provide cover for landing the ground troops. But the British didn't have that cover, and now time was running out. On the 18th of May, the second wave of ships, including ferries and the cruise liner the Canberra, arrived just off the Falklands. On board was the amphibious landing force, and they were led by Brigadier Julian Thompson. Thompson was an experienced commander. He knew that his troops were vulnerable without air superiority, but the pressure of time meant the landings had to go ahead. Plumped for this natural harbour here, at San Carlos Bay. It would be out of range of enemy artillery and was only very lightly defended. A great advantage for any amphibious landing. And here I am with San Carlos Bay behind me, and that's the entrance over there. That's where the British landing force came in. These hills also offered Thompson's men and ships some protection against low-level air attack. But there was one problem with this landing site. It was a long way from San Carlos here, across to the spot where Thompson knew the decisive battle would be fought, here in the strongly defended mountains just west of Stanley. Between the two was 50 miles of difficult country.
In the early hours of the 21st of May, 3,000 British troops headed for the landing beaches. Each man carried his rifle, ammunition, and enough rations for 2 days. This was the moment they'd been waiting for weeks. Once ashore, the British troops made their way up into the hills and dug themselves into strong positions. One unit, the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, known as 2 Para, were based up here on the Sussex Mountains overlooking the bay. It was just a question of time before the Argentinians arrived. The men braced themselves for an air attack. Then, at 10:30, all hell broke loose.
The Argentinian High Command sent in wave after wave of their fighter bombers from the mainland. For 5 hours, these aircraft bombed and strafed the fleet sitting in the bay. The surrounding hills made it almost impossible for the ship's radars to detect the enemy aircraft, so the British were unable to get a fix on the attacking planes until it was too late.
Under attack,